Welcome to week 10. In today's class, I think it's the last important topic that you'll need in order to get started with assignment 2 if you haven't already done so. We're seeing authentication, and we'll use a new module for this called Passport. What we will be covering is how you can set up registration and login, how you can create your own users collection so you have control over which user gets to create a new pin or not, and so on. So today's class will cover all of the today's class will cover all, I don't know why my voice sounds like this. Okay. But probably because it's early morning. But you'll everything you need for user verification, authentication to cover who has access to what functionalities, which should also be practicing in assignment 2. All of that will be covered today. In next class, we will simply see the edit and delete routes, which we haven't created so far. That class I won't be recording because it's just something to go through, and we've done the insert and create functionalities. So I won't be recording that, but we will be covering it in class. So the steps involved for our process today is firstly, we'll set up our Node.js project like we usually do. You have been provided with the starter code. I shared a live share link in case you need it. You have this recording as well as the PDF to help you with the process step by step. After that, we are going to configure passport.js, set up a user collection in our database. So from last week, if you still have that database up and running, then you'll remember that we had a database created with a pins collection in it. We'll try to access that same database again, but we'll change or we'll add a users collection to it. We'll implement the registration and login route, and then we'll do something called serialization and deserialization. And I thought we'll cover the theory now before we actually get to it. When you register, of course, you successfully log in. Every time you log in, a session is created just like you have in the real world. So when that session is created, what essentially is happening is serialization and deserialization. Every time the user is trying to access a functionality, we need to make sure they are registered, they are authenticated, and they are allowed to perform a certain action. So in order to store their information in our session, we will be doing serialization and deserialization. So the first or the former is the process of converting a user's information into a simple format that can be stored over the network. So over your server, in order to store the user's information so that we can verify it every time they want to perform a particular action, or just to make sure the correct user is logged in and so on, we will perform serialization to store their information in a session in a cookie. Okay. Now, in order to send any information back or the other way around, we will perform deserialization, which is the reverse process, and it takes the serialized data from our session, from our browser, and reconstructs it into that user object that we require in order to retrieve data or store data or receive any information over the network, and convert it back into information that your computer or your server code can read. After that, middleware for authentication. Once all of these routes are set up, simply what we'll do is create a function, and that function will allow you to have control, and you can apply that to your routes. So once that function is created, you can apply that to, let's say, your create pin route, and then you can decide whether if the user is authenticated or no, and only then they're allowed to perform that action. So that's the middleware for authentication step. And lastly, user verification and access control. Once we have that function set up, we will also make sure the verification process works, and accordingly we'll provide them access to certain functionalities on your website. And lastly, of course, sorry, lastly, log out. So let's just get started. Just to make sure I am recording this, I'll minimize it. Okay. So just to go over our starter code, the project structure so far, nothing changes. We've covered most of what we need. We have our database. server.js, and roots and views. Okay, mainly a new folder that we have today is helpers, and we'll get to that sort of later in class. Inside server.js, if you remember from last week, we have moved all of our pins and database code into separate files. So we are importing that up here. Last week we did cover having pins in a separate root, right? Did we do that? Okay. So pins and database are in separate files. And after that, once you've imported Express, body parser to read information over your server, and path to access files outside of server.js, once you have all of these necessary files and modules imported, we have our asynchronous function set up over here, setup server, inside which we'll create our server by setting the port, creating an instance of Express, calling the necessary modules on it. Okay, this is all like we've seen in our previous classes. We use Express.js as a middleware to call EJS and render EJS templates. And in our previous class, all we did was call the database file and call the setup function inside it. This week, we've changed the structure of that a little bit just to make it a little easier and error-free, so to say. I converted that database function into a class. Okay, that's what we're doing here. Let's go to the database file, database.js, and you'll see that last week we had a simple asynchronous function that was set up. Instead of that, this week, what's written in the comments is that a bug was found, and you may have, if you tried working on assignment, your coding challenge 7, when you run your code, it's the first time it's working fine, but if you try to make any changes and refresh your server, you might get a MongoDB error. So to fix that, okay, I explained it in the comments, and we've converted our function into a class, and we're essentially doing the same thing. Your necessary modules are being imported outside, and you've created a database class within which we have our collections. So, hi. You can define all of your required collection names in here, as well as your client variables and so on. And inside this class, we have our asynchronous setup function nested, okay? And we are exporting, now instead of exporting all of these values and variables, we are simply exporting the database class at the end instead of the setup function, as well as the object ID, because server.js or our other roots will require access to it. Okay, so instead of passing last week, if you remember, we were passing the client variable, database collection, setup function, object ID, and so on. Instead of doing all that, now we're simply passing our entire class, okay, and the object ID module from MongoDB. Okay, so inside this class, we have declared our variables that we might need to pass to our server. And within that, we have our asynchronous function. Or following that, we have our asynchronous function. And nothing's changed inside this really. We are trying to connect with our database. And one thing that's actually changed is this keyword this that you see. So within your class, if you've declared a variable called client, database, or collections, what this signifies is that this client variable, you see, we've not declared it anywhere. Here we have const MongoDB, but we've not written var collections here. And besides that, it's inside this class. In order to let the function know that we are searching for a variable client within this class itself, if you're trying to call any variable declared within this class itself, you're going to use this keyword. So this database setup logic is extracted out of the main server file. Okay, sorry. I thought I was explaining this keyword here, but I am not. But essentially what it means is that if you're trying to access any of your variables within this class, you're going to have to preface it with this keyword. So inside your asynchronous setup function, this client is our MongoDB connection. Then we set up our database. And the code that follows is what we saw last week. We use the database.list collections function with no filters in order to only get the names, name only true, of our collections. Okay, so line 15 over here, what it does is gets our collections from our database in an array format for us. So any pins that we created last week, we can get it from our database. and we've not set up our users collection yet, but using this in the future, once this code is run, it'll be able to also pull not only our pins collection, but also users once we create it. We are mapping that array that we get back over here into a variable called names. And once we do that, this following block of code, what it's doing is if the names that we got from if the names of our collection that we got from our database exists already, then we are simply getting those values or that collection and assigning it to our local collection variable here. So this collections.key is going to point towards every object inside our collections variable over here, which currently we only have pins. So since this pins exists in our database, it's going to transfer all of those objects into that variable. Okay, and we'll console log it for ourselves that, okay, that we were able to find this. However, if we create a new users collection today, so let's say we have users, and currently by default, we're going to set it to null. Every time this code runs, we are going to check if it's already created in our database. We are going to assign its values to our variable locally over here, but currently it is null. So if for example, users is not a collection we've created yet, so since that doesn't exist, the first time we run this code, what's going to happen is console log, you'll see this message in the console log that the collection was created, and you'll use this database.create collection functionality in order to create that collection inside our database. If that makes sense. To summarize, these lines of code basically make our connection. Here we are trying to pull our existing collections. Here, if a collection exists, we are getting its values so that we can display all the pins in our front end. If not, we are creating the necessary collections, and now we can use that for our login, registration, and other routes. Okay, so to break down your code, that's what we are doing over here. At the end, we are simply console logging database initialize. Now, to be honest, I don't remember why we are using this initialized variable. We probably don't need it. I'm going to remove it for now and hopefully it doesn't give us an error. But essentially, I had that in order to let the server know that the database is set up. I think server.js might require it, so I'll just keep it. Initially, it's set to false. So I won't remove it. I'm going to keep it. Initially, it's set to false. And at the end, once all of this has taken place, we just let the server know that we're setting it to true because the database setup has taken place. Only if it has taken place successfully would we be able to reach to this line and set that to true and console log that our database has been initialized. Once all of this is done, we'll simply export that class database to our server.js or any file that tries to import our database or call upon it, and as well as object ID. Does anyone remember what object ID is? Why are we passing that? Because it's simply a module from MongoDB that we are passing to the server, for example. No, that's okay. Yeah.
Does it make it like an HTML that it can refer to in EJS once it
is kind of like that, I would say. It's more of like if you've observed, let's go to MongoDB. So open your database. What it is last week, or if you've worked with MongoDB, you might remember that your IDs for each of your objects that you insert in your database get created automatically. Right? So last week we created this, or whenever we created this Pinterest database, I'm just going to click on it. Okay. In the left side panel, we have the database option. We can click there and browse collections to see what our database currently looks like. So last week we had inserted 2 pins, okay, with some cat gifs or I think some random images from Pexels. So what you'll see here is that this title image description is what we provided from our side. However, this ID of our element, it's in an Yeah, it's an object format. So in order to read it or provide it, 1 second, let me read that properly, which way it is. Let me hover. Yeah, so object ID is a representation of your object ID type. What that essentially means is if we want to pass any ID that we've created for our element or anything to make it MongoDB readable. Okay, so in order for our database to understand the ID that we are providing it locally. So let's say, if you remember the code from last week, what we are doing is the user is allowed to create a new pin, and once they've created a new pin, we are passing that ID over the server and we are using that ID to fetch information. So if we go to our pins root, this is what we worked on last week. If you want to get a specific pin using its ID, then in order to fetch that information from the database, you need to convert it into an object ID format so that MongoDB can understand what it is. So coming back to our database, you see this is in an object ID format. Okay, when we are working with our pins locally, all we are working with is the simple ID string. We don't pass it back and forth in this object ID format. But if we need to fetch any information from our database, we'll need to convert it back to something that MongoDB understands. And only then would we be able to fetch that information from MongoDB. So for that reason, we are using that object ID functionality.
ID exclusive to MongoDB.
Yes.
Other databases use object ID.
To my knowledge, I've worked with a few, and it only is a part of MongoDB, because even if you go up here in database.js, you'll see that from the MongoDB module, we are trying to use this class. So it's specific to it. Maybe the syntax or name of the terminology same in another database system, but I don't know. Okay. So now that we've understood what's going on in our database, just my link might be old and you might get that same error. So you may want to substitute this MongoDB link provided with your database. So how to find that is going back to MongoDB Atlas under the Pinterest project folder, just making sure I'm in there. I'm going to click on database. And now I can connect with my cluster of collections. Go to drivers, copy this link, go back. And for this reason, we need to make sure we usually remember our passwords or save it. I tend to keep it the same for class, test user 123. And now, I don't know if our roots are set up, but let's try running server.js. What is this error? There's some error coming from the MongoDB module. I don't know if you all are getting this as well. Just to fix it, I can delete the MongoDB module from my node modules in order to get rid of that error. Okay, it's still red.
I didn't run into the error.
Oh, you didn't? Okay, it's okay. Even if you ever get that in it, I don't see what's wrong because I haven't changed anything. I did move the file location. Import not view.
Okay, but I'm thinking Pinterest, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just to follow along the database from last week, we called it Pinterest. You want to go to database, hit connect, go to drivers, and copy this connection link. That's usually all we have to do on MongoDB side. Keep it simple. Once we have this link, I deleted from my node modules folder because of some error. I don't know why this is still showing. I haven't run the code yet, but I'm just going to quickly reinstall MongoDB. If you're not getting any error, that's perfectly great. Okay, and I'm going to close it in order to run our file. Let's see if we encounter any issues. Coming back to server.js. So we called our database class, by the way, just getting back to this real quick. our database file today is stored in a variable called database service. Inside that, we have our class name. And using that variable, we are calling the setup function. Okay. And then again, calling all of our pins root, and we'll go over that. Great. I moved my file. I don't know, it may be because of that. But if we have no errors, that's always good news. But to console log it, our database got initialized, right? To go over it step by step, we called our database file. And then within our setup server function, which we always remember to call at the end of our file, inside this, we called our database class, the one that we created with all of our client variables, and we had a setup function inside that. So that's what we called. And so that's why we're getting all of these messages that database initialized, collection was fetched, and the server got set up, and collection was also created. So the first collection pins was fetched because it already existed in our database. However, users was new. We did not have a collection called new users, so it got created. Okay, so if we go back to our page here, localhost 3000, from last week, what we have is our pins. If I try to create a new pin, let's hope it works. Hello world, image URL. Let me get an image. I usually like to go to Pexels for royalty-free, good quality HD images. I'm going to simply click on an image, right click on it to copy the address. And if I paste it, you see that the image loads properly in my URL. So I can basically add this to our database. Currently, our database, as you can see, or our form is not accepting like uploading files. We've not gotten to that, and we'll require more space in our server. So instead, we are using URLs. So we are not uploading local files. We are adding image URLs. And let's say this is a test description and submit. If everything is set up correctly and you followed, or you at least you saw last week's code, or essentially I've provided the starter code to you, so this should work for you as well. But if you see here in our root, on localhost 3000, we have a root called pin singular, following which we have passed the object ID for the object that we just created in our URL. And we are using this to pass it to our database and fetch that information to display it here. So it's nice that if you've created a post or a pin, you'd like to be redirected to see that information. And that's exactly what we are doing here. If it's created successfully, we show the user that, hey, this is the entry that you just created. If we go back to our Pinterest board, you see that we have all of our existing pins displayed here. And the more we add, the more this gets created. All right. And we didn't have the time to work on this last week because we ran out of time in class. But another route, or the final route that we did create, is again reusing that pins using ID route. So if we click on any specific element, we are creating a route called pin, and we are passing again that ID in a string format. And since we weren't able to cover this in class, I created a recording and put it on Blackboard later. So let's go over it really quick. We weren't able to create that route that gets your pin from using its ID. So we had a route to create a new pin. It was simply called pin. And this route, what it does is we have our pin, and it's looking for a variable, or it's a placeholder for your ID from your URL. And just like we did in our early on classes, where we are printing hello world or hello person's name by passing the name in the URL, here we are passing the ID. We are using MongoDB's find one functionality, and we are passing it to our database in order to fetch that one pin from our pins collection. So inside this route, we are awaiting on our connection with our database. From our collections pins, we are using the find one functionality provided by MongoDB in order to, again, we're using from our database file, the object ID class, in order to make this ID from string format into something that MongoDB can read. And once we have that data passed back to us, we have a file called existing.egs that is simply rendering our existing pins one by one. Okay, so that's the route that we set up last week. And just to go over it again, this is what we used last week, and we are calling our database file, we are calling express, within which we have a function. Just like we did with our database, we need to pass this function to any file that calls it, like server.js, so that server.js is able to set up our pins route for us when this code is run. Inside this function, we have our different routes. So we use the express router, so the router class, because we already have an instance called app in server.js, right? In server.js, we have app running. In order to build on this instance of express and call our pins, routers, all of the routes in there, we created a new variable called router that uses this router class inside express, and that is what we've built each of our routes on. So it's not app.get outside of server.js. We have our router created over here, okay, for all of our routes, which is to display, the default is to display all of our pins, to render the form where you can create a new pin, the route where you actually accept data from the form and you, add that information to your database. So that's the route where you create a new pin once the user has submitted the form, right? And the one where you render your pin. So I'm going to move this. You don't have to do this, but just I'm going to move this a little lower in our file because I want to ask you a question. Okay. Can someone help me out here? We have two routes, router, like pin and pin. What's the difference between both of these routes since it's the same? Both the routes have the same name, right? The routes are either the default route or either getting your pin by ID. What is the difference between this first route pin and the second route pin?
That have something to do with router.get and router.post.
Correct. So we are working with different methods. So inside our router, in order to simply render new.egs the first time when the page loads, we are using the router.get method, or rather just simply the get method. The get method essentially does not expect anything back from the user. It's simply providing an output to the user. Once the user has filled up this form, so if we go to new.egs inside our views file, inside pins. Okay, new.egs is a form that we have created in order for the user to submit the information of the pin that they want to create. Okay, once they have submitted it, they are posting their information back to the server and we are dealing with it. So we're still rendering pins.new.egs if there's an error, but if there's no error, we're simply inserting that data object to our database. So the difference between both of this method is one simply displays an output, which is our form, and second one deals with the form submission. Okay. So we've seen all of our setup files. We saw server.js. Actually, I'll just have it open here side by side so you can understand what I'm doing or how to go about that PDF. Okay, so this is what we're seeing. Currently, we saw server.js. We saw our pins route. All of our pins are in a separate file. We saw our database setup. So now that we've done all this, we can go ahead and start working on our user authentication. Now, this file's for my reference. You can follow along with the code. Just like we did for our pins, where we had a file called pins.js in order to render all of our Pinterest pins creation, update, delete, which we'll work on next week. But all of our pins related functionalities and routes are in a file called pins.js that server.js calls during setup, right? So we are calling the pins router function inside our server.js. but essentially all of our roots are in a separate file. Imagine if we had all of these Pinterest roots inside our already pretty large server.js file. It would be a little chaotic and difficult to manage. So similarly, now that we want to set up our authentication roots, in that same roots folder, you have been provided with a file called auth.js, which is authentication.js. And we, just like we did with pins, we will also create our own separate login, registration, user verification roots all inside this file. Okay, so inside your provided starter code folder, you have this roots subfolder inside which you have auth.js. So within that, let's start creating our functions for registration, login, and logout. So const express equals require express. So always before we start, we need to call the modules that we need. So we'll require express. Inside that, we'll always have our function that needs to do something with the use of express. So auth router, and we'll pass our database in it. And at the end of it, we need to make sure we are exporting module.exports auth router. So what we're simply doing is this function that we've created, any file that calls auth.js, we are exporting this function created to it. Now you may also notice that we need to firstly call this function somewhere. And since we are not calling it, this database variable over here is kind of gray. Even express, because we haven't used it yet, in VS Code, it kind of hints to us that this variable you've created or you're expecting, but it's not been called or passed from anywhere. Where that will happen is inside our server.js file. So I'm going to go back to server.js real quick. Just like we did with our pins root, I'm going to duplicate that line. And instead of pins router, I'm going to call auth router. And instead of calling pins.js, I will call auth.js. Okay, so any of your files that server.js will need, okay, because server.js is our main guy, it sets up our project for us. So we are calling our database file in there. We are calling express, all of our necessary modules. The pins root as well as the auth root is going to be called here. Okay, once you've imported this file outside of our setup function, we are now able to call it inside here. So again, I'll duplicate this line. And before pins router database, I'm going to set up auth router. I'm going to call our function and pass our database variable to it from here. Okay, I'll actually also I'll call auth.router before. When we are done with class today, what we'll essentially have at hand is a root or several roots that are only able to be rendered if the user is verified. So the first thing that we'll need to do is make sure they're authenticated. A lot of our pins roots will depend on that, which is why we'll import our authentication root first before our pins root. So I move that up and down. Just make sure you have that. I don't think it should be a problem, but it's the first thing that we need to have set up. So we'll call that file first, and we'll call that function first as well. Okay. If you haven't done this, then it's quite similar to pins router. You just need to create duplicates of it in server.js. Okay. So I'm going to go back to auth.js. Does anyone need this page? Very good. Coming back to our authentication router function, we now are passing database to it, but we are not using that variable inside here, nor are we using express. So they're still kind of gray. Let's go ahead and set up all of our roots. Just like we did with our pins, we'll again need to call or create a separate instance or helper router variable. So var router equals to express. Within express, we have a router class that we'd like to call. Okay, it's not giving much of a definition. Never mind. After this, just like we did with pins right again, we need to simply call our instance and set up our roots. So the different roots required for today are, of course, register, Okay, we have to have, just like we always do, we need to have a promise at the end. So request.response. And I'm going to copy this. And the other route that we'll also require is login. To begin with, if you see in the views folder, we have a subfolder called auth that is provided to you. Besides partials and pins from last week, we have a new auth folder here as well, which consists of login and register. So if you're done typing this file, I can switch there. Angie, the live share link is on Blackboard, and also your final code is provided to you. So you can just copy paste and follow along in case you don't have this code written or any of our previous setup you don't have. So the live share link, you can basically copy paste code and catch up. Okay, but assuming you all are done creating these routes, inside these routes, we'll obviously need to render some files. Those files have been created for you. Now, just to speed things along, I was intending on that we code this together just for practice of EJS syntax, but I provided it to you so that we can mainly focus on the backend functionalities. But let's expand this and see what we have. Our first function, of course, before login, users need to have the ability to register. So we'll take a look at that file first. Like we always do, we've created separate components for our header files, our head files, partials. Okay, those are going to render our title for each page. So this page is not called create new pin. We may want to fix that. This page is called registration or register. Let's say registration.
Is it just me? But my register.ejs doesn't have anything.
I thought I replaced that code last night. But I think maybe it's not reflecting. For now, if you've downloaded the entire lesson class code, the final folder will have these files.
Oh.
So you can just copy paste that code, or even if you use the live share link. So I'll give you like 2 minutes to do that. Simply, you should have register and login.ejs filled up.
And we also see login, but
Yeah. Lo, is it reflecting for you, the file?
They were empty when I opened them up in the class code.
Okay. So just yeah, copy
Yeah.
paste these two files. Yeah.
The live share, are we supposed to be able to see the code when we revisit it later?
No. It's just to share with you right now
For today.
in case of any typos or something like that.
In the final, there's no folder.
This folder?
Yeah. Under inside views, right?
Yeah. Oh, once.
Index.ejs for instance.
That is odd.
Wait, I'm helping.
I don't have it.
Final use and then on.
Yeah, I did not change that. You should have it. If
Sorry, I was
okay. That's okay. I'm assuming everyone's copied it. If not, we don't have anything to write here, so you could do that and still listen. So the first, for all of our EJS files, the main files besides the partials, we'll have to include the partials first. Head.ejs, as we know, if we just quickly check it out. Head.egs is our starting HTML code, and it's not completely HTML, it is an EGS file, and it's expecting a page variable value over here. So every time we call our head.egs file, you need to pass a variable page with some value. So our current, for the title, so our current page is for registration, register.egs. So that's what we need to pass. It might say something else, I changed it. It might say create new pins. Following that, we have our header, which if we quickly again take a look at that, that is our navigation. And that's where we have access to the route, which you can click on in order to create a new pin. And that currently redirects us to our new pin form. Okay. Footer and foot is just our copyright and the closing tags for our HTML and body tags. So those are all the partials we have included in our register.egs file. And this structure of this form for registration essentially copied from our login, no, sorry, creating a new pin. Okay, so we're using the same styling, our divs. We are creating a form over here, and there's no EGS syntax within the form as such. But again, it's going to use a post method. And when you do submit the form or you do post your form, we are going to call the register route that we've currently created in auth.js, but it's empty. Okay, so auth.js is going to render this file for us. Just like we did with the create pins method, we'll have two methods for registration as well. In order to render this file, we have our get method set up in auth.js, and we'll get back to it. But we need to create another route that's going to deal with this form once the user has submitted their information. So this form, again, styling wise, it's exactly the same. I simply change the fields to username, password, and at the end, the button says register. And in case there is there's some issue that they were supposed to fill in password, but they haven't during registration, to make sure everything is filled and we can properly register them, and then we can use that information for login, so on. Just to make sure they've filled all fields. If they haven't, we are again going to display an error message that, hey, coming from our auth.js file, that, hey, you've missed out on filling the username, or you haven't filled out the password, the field is still empty, or you click the register button before tackling the form at all. Okay, so any error message from our backend is being displayed here. Again, just like we did with our pins, in case they missed out on adding the image URL, we displayed an error message. So it's the same thing. Login.js EJS is also similar. We called our partials and the same form. And in case they did not fill out the password, we can't proceed with verifying if they're a valid user. So the error message would be displayed here. So we know that both of our files, login and register EJS, they require no variables as such besides the error message. So if we go back to auth.js, not in our views, inside our routes, we had auth.js, right? We currently left this blank. If we wanted to render our EJS files inside of this, we're also going to have to make sure that we are also passing an error message, which is currently empty. Okay, so if error message is null, then that paragraph won't show up that, hey, you've got an error. So what we'll do inside this route is in response. Okay, both of these methods are get, they are not post. So in response to the user accessing this register route, we are going to render inside our auth file, which is inside views, we have register. Okay, we are going to render that file, and we are going to make sure that that error message variable that we need to pass to it, we are going to set it to null. If we don't do this, then what's going to happen is register.egs will give us an error saying this variable is not found. Okay, so when we are rendering our register page for the first time, we need to make sure we have no errors being passed to it. Let's say we do create a post method where we check that, okay, if any of the fields are empty, let the user know that they haven't completed the form. In that case, we'll pass an error message. But currently, this is going to just display the form for our user the first time. So the first time you load a page, there can't possibly be any user error, right? So once you've set this up, let's go to our server over here and search for localhost 3000/register. Cannot get register. Going to go to a debug console. I think maybe my server, okay, refresh my server. That must be the issue. Still have router.use require middleware but undefined. Where have we done router.use? Just going to try to run this code again. Let me just see if I've missed anything that we're supposed to do. We have our pin, all of this code was provided to us, server.js, pins root, database setup, nothing to change so far. User authentication, we called express, module exported, auth router, register, error message null, auth router database, just going back to server.js. Make sure we have auth imported and we had called it, so the function is spelled right. We set up our EJS files, login and register, and should show us the file. So I'm just going to quickly try running this again. Server.js selected, run and debug. Router.use requires a middleware function but got undefined. Terminal, I'm just going to make sure I have npm install express. What it's trying to say is I've not done this router function correctly, but over here, but I should have. So I'm going to try to not render the server, the authentication route. Let's do server.js, run and debug. Go back to debug console. Still getting an error. Server.js. We call, I don't know. We install Express. We can, shouldn't be the issue, but we can try to install EJS. Just I'll do npm install so to make sure all of our dependencies are inside our database, inside our files. Run server.js, go back to debug console. It should give us the database setup messages. And this error is coming from server.js line 21, maybe. Let's see what's there. So there's an issue over here. All right. Let's go over it. We are setting up everything. The issue is that when we are calling this file, the router.use requires a middleware function but got undefined. So let's try to debug this together. I'm going to have a console log message here, and that's essentially what console log is for developers to try to print out messages. And so you can keep track of how far our code is reaching. So let's say inside the setup function, we know that everything is going well until line 19 because we are getting these messages from our database, right? That the collection was fetched, users was fetched. So right after the database has been set up, are you all getting the same error, by the way? Okay, but okay, I'll just console log it here. Then going back to auth.js, over here, let's say, just want to make sure I've imported everything necessary. Yeah, so far, so good. let's say if we've reached this file inside our auth router, let's do console.log inside the auth function. Okay, so we can see if we've reached this far or no. And then maybe right after the router, which I'm guessing this won't print, console log auth router setup. These steps you don't have to do. You can maybe follow, just take a look at it to understand that in case you get an error, how can you track it? Because this says that there's an issue with router.use. I'm going to run and debug server.js. It's going to set up the database for us. So it's went inside the setup function in server.js, went inside the auth function, the auth router setup, it printed it out. So this line is giving us an error. Express router. I'm going to quickly Google this issue because I've not had it before. Requires middleware function, but call an object. Okay. Oh, okay. We're missing out on a value. So when server.js is trying to run this file, let me just go to pins.js. Yeah, we are not just supposed auth.js. No, well, we are passing the file. Okay, I thought we are also supposed to pass router back to it here, but that's, oh, okay, my bad. Inside our function itself, we are supposed to have this line called return router. Okay, I found the issue and I forgot about it. Okay, so whenever you call a function, it's supposed to return some value back to whoever called the function. So in auth.router, we are setting up our routes. Okay, but once this function has been completed, we are supposed to send something back to the file that called it. We are calling the auth router function inside server.js, right? So when we do call it here, it can't proceed to the next line until we've got a response back from authrouter.js. The response back, yes, we are passing this function back to any file that's calling this, but our function is not returning anything to server.js. What return router does is, I'm glad we got this issue, so you won't be stuck later, but what return router does is all of these routes that we've tried to build on this router variable, all of those routes get passed back to server.js. So if we don't do this line, server.js is like, what route are you talking about? Okay, so it's not sure what's register. So in order to pass our login, register, any other methods that we create over here, inside your function itself, you need to make sure you're passing this router variable back to server.js. Now it should run. So I'm going to select server.js again, run and debug, open our terminal. Inside debug console, we are seeing that our database got set up. We went inside the setup function, we went inside the authentication function, and everything went well. Okay, so going back to localhost 3000, now let's see what our register form looks like. Our register form has, again, as I said, we are using the same classes like we did for our Pinterest form. So it's asking for a username, password, and we have a register button at the end. Now, because we are coding it ourselves, we know that if we try to submit the form right now, it's going to not accept any information because we haven't set up those routes. So let's now that this is up and running, let's go ahead and also do this for login firstly. So I'm going to copy this line, paste it here. The only thing that needs to change is we are not rendering register. In our login route, we are rendering login.ejs. Okay. Okay, we were here, we rendered this, our EJS files are created. Now we'll create the routes that are going to deal with our login and registration forms. So this section will have registration. This section will have login. Okay, so we'll keep the login separate for now. Right under the router.get method for registration, I'll just copy paste this because a little lazy, but we'll just paste, copy paste it and change the get method to post. So now this root, even though it has the same name, it's registering the same file for now, which I will change. What it essentially does is it's going to deal with the submitted forms information. So when the form is posted or submitted, it's going to be sent to this register root. We are going to save that data. So let data equals to request body. So over the server, the values that are being requested for, which are the form fields, that's going to come in a body format. Once we have this information, we can do further setup. Okay. Now, whenever you're registering a user, yes, simple way is that you take their username, you take their password in a string format and you save it in your database. But that is extremely insecure. If you simply copy paste and save their information in your database, anyone who gets access to your database can see your user's password, can hack into their account. That's not good. So in order to deal with it, what we are going to use is passport.js and this crypto package. Okay. Crypto allows us to, it's not related to Bitcoin or anything, not related to cryptocurrency. What we are going to use it for is to encrypt our user's password. So right after we call our express module up here, we are going to also call const crypto equals to require. In brackets, we are going to call the crypto module. Now, does anyone remember how can we check if, just like Express, do we have this crypto module or no? If I want to check that, where do I go?
Node modules folder.
The node modules folder, also the packages. So the node modules folder is convenient. We can like go and see. Currently, I don't see crypto installed. But if we minimize this, go to package.json, you should have all of your dependencies listed here. We don't have crypto, and I'm pretty sure we should have had it installed. If not, we can simply go to our terminal, do npm install crypto, and it gets installed. So now if we go back to package.json, you can see that we also have crypto over here. If you go to node modules, we also have crypto over here. Good thing we checked, else we'd be wondering why that wasn't working. Minimizing node modules, coming back to our code, server still running. We've imported this file. Now inside our root, we can sort of use it to encrypt our password. Okay. Now inside our post method, we are going to create a variable called salt. Okay, so const salt equals to, and I'll explain to you why salt, crypto.randombytes 16.toString hex. Now, what this line means is that in order to, in general, if you want to encrypt your password using this technology or anything else, when you start developing code, to encrypt your file, you need another variable or some sort of a magic string to encrypt your password. And even when you need to decrypt it, you need to have access to both, not only that salt, but also your actual password, which is encrypted. So what the reason it's called salt by developers is, you can call it anything, but the reason you call it salt is because a string of salt or a grain of salt or anything is always so randomized. If you try to go under a microscope and look at 2 grains of salt, they're always different. So salt essentially means every time this line runs, we are going to use the crypto module to get 16 a string that has 16 bits of random bytes, sorry, in a hexadecimal format. If you just look up hexadecimal, if you already have like a computer science background, you might know this, but hexadecimal format basically means it will get over here, it will use numbers from 0 to, this is decimal. It will use numbers from 0 to 9 and alphabets from A to F, and it will use these values to create a random string for you, which is going to have 16 values within it. Okay, so I'll close this. So we are using the crypto module in order to get or create that salt. Once we do so, we can actually start hashing our password using a promise. So const hashed password, I'll minimize this. Okay, hashed password, we'll make that into a variable which holds a promise. So await new promise. Now, if you remember promises from our early classes, promises essentially ensure us that you will get a result that's sent back to you, and the two variables or the two parameters that, go inside this are resolve and reject. So resolve is in case your code runs successfully, the resolve message gets sent back. Else you have the reject message that says, hey, no, you've got an error. We won't be doing too much error handling because we are not expecting errors in our code. So instead of passing that reject variable, I'm simply going to pass an underscore, okay? Because it's not necessary. We are not going to do error handling right now. So instead of passing a reject message over here inside my promise, I'm just saying resolve. And arrow function. Inside here, we'll call the crypto module, and we'll use another function, which I need to spell it out, PBKDF2. Now that's not another encrypted thing, it's a function. If you hover over it, you can see the description. What it stands for is it provides an asynchronous password-based key derivation function. Okay, so that version 2. So that's what your function is. It's an abbreviation for password-based key derivation function 2. So inside our crypto module, what's going to happen is we'll call this function, and we need to pass not only our password, so data.password. We also need to pass salt in it, 310,000. And again, I'll explain why. 32 and SHA-256. Okay, before I continue writing, PBKDF2 function expects certain values. First thing is data.password. From the form submission that we have received earlier, we stored that information in a variable called data. Inside that form body, we know that we have a form field called password. That's the first thing that we are passing. So we are not seeing it, but over the server, when the registration form is submitted, we are not storing it anywhere. We are passing it to this encryption function. We are passing that random salt that we have created. And the following three values are 310,000 is just a value that developers use. So if you look up documentation, it's a recommendation from previous JavaScript developers. What that means is it's going to use this PBKDF2 function is going to use salt and the password provided and encrypt it 310,000 times. So it's not only going to encrypt it once, twice, it's going to keep encrypting it till it's as unbreakable as possible for hackers to increase the difficulty. So 310,000 signifies that that's how many times it's going to encrypt it before you store your password anywhere. So we are trying to be as secure as possible. So this number is sort of a developer recommendation. 32, if I'm not wrong, yeah, it's how long the password will be. So it's going to use this 16 character string that we have and whatever the users passed, and it's going to encrypt it in a way that at the end, the password that you do receive that to store in your database is going to be 32 characters long. And there are different encryption methods. If you really get into, I guess, cybersecurity or computer science in general, there are different ways to encrypt your code or values. So SHA-256 is one of those methods. So inside your PBKDF2 function, you're going to pass in your user's password from the form, salt, the number of times you want your value to be encrypted, how long do you want your character for your password to be upon encryption, and your preferred method of encryption. Okay. I honestly don't remember other methods, but if you look it up, you should find information on SHA-256 and other similar encryption methods. But this is what we're going to do for today. Following that, we need to have a callback or a resolve message sent back to our promise. So again, not doing any error handling. First field is going to be blank or an underscore, hashed password. This variable that we've just assigned our promise to, we're going to have a callback there. And we are going to have a resolve message returned back to it, consisting of its own variable, hash password. Okay. Yeah, so within this callback, we'll call the resolve method that returns the hash password back. And now this is ready to store inside our database. Okay, so for all of this encryption in this part, it looks like just 3-4 lines, but we did a lot of sort of securing of our password over here. And now that we have this values safe and ready to store, what we can do is insert it into our database. So let user, for the current user whose form we are dealing with, once we've encrypted the password and we've stored that value inside our hash password variable, we are now ready to store their username and password in our database. So let the variable user await. Inside our database, we have collections. And if you remember, we have created a collection called users. And to that, we are going to insert one new user's information, MongoDB function, and ... data. What ... data is, I don't remember the definition, but it's basically mapping out all of your information. So to functions, thought I had the explanation for it somewhere here. Yeah. What is triple dot data? It essentially means that you are spreading or collecting elements. In this case, it creates an object of the user's provided data as is, and then using the parameters that follow, you can override some of the information, right? So what we are doing here is we are not simply passing data to our MongoDB. The form data that we do get from the front end, we are storing that, but because we are storing it in this manner, we have the ability to rewrite. Before it's inserted into the database, we have the ability to override the password variable with our hashed password in a string format. So let's do that. Hexadecimal. Okay, so in order to convert whatever this crypto function has returned to us, we are going to store it in a hexadecimal format, in a string hexadecimal format in our database. So we are essentially we're trying to insert the form information into MongoDB. Before we do that, we just want to make sure that we don't enter the raw password, we enter the hashed password. Following that, in future, we'll need to decrypt it. So don't forget to also insert salt. Okay, we will require this variable to decrypt it in the future as well. So when we are storing the user's information, not only are we storing their name, username, and password, we are also storing salt. Okay, once this is done, we need to make sure our user is redirected. So, when we created our pins, what we did was once the pin is created, we are showing the user, we are giving them some sort of message to understand that, yes, you have registered successfully and you are now being redirected to your home page or your login page or the dashboard. Okay. Before we create that login setup, can someone tell me why I'm getting this error on my await message? Yes, I have forgotten to write the async keyword here, which is why that red squiggly line was appearing. Now that we have inserted our user's information successfully into the database, we've hashed our password. So we were doing password hashing using crypto. We were inserting user into, or rather adding user into the database upon successful registration. After this, we need to redirect the user to log in. Okay, so once the user has successfully set up, we need to allow them to get logged in. So to do that, we are going to do await new promise. Inside this, again, we are going to do resolve. We are not going to handle any rejection messages today. So underscore to leave that blank. Okay, inside this request.login, and we need to pass in some information here. If we quickly hover over this login variable, it basically, for us, it already exists. It creates a login session for the user. So it's a function that we can call upon. So request.login, and over here, we need to pass in a couple of variables for that login functionality to work. Firstly is the user that we just inserted into the database. So inserted ID in a string format. If you watched last week's recording of that route that we weren't able to cover in class, as soon as the user, okay, wait, going back to pins.js quickly, just to show you, but as soon as the user creates that new pin, okay, we were using that inserted ID for this new entry that we just created. So we're storing that in a variable, right? Inside that variable, we are getting that fresh new inserted ID, and we were converting it into a string format. Similarly, inside our login route, we need to, for the user that we just inserted into the database, we are using that inserted ID to a string format. Also, username. Now we are only getting the ID back. We can get the username from that form information. We still have access to that data variable, right? So ID is something that's going to come from the database. We are not creating it. Username we have access to from the form submission. So data.username. Okay. And at the end of this request login functionality, we'll have our resolve message, which is login has taken place successfully. So simply pass the resolve method in here. Okay, if this takes place successfully, then we are allowing the user to get redirected to the home page. So response.redirect, go to the home page, and what's happening here is we are storing this information in their login session, and we can use that in order to change the appearance of our navigation. I hope we're doing that part next. Okay. We haven't gotten to that yet, but we are basically storing their information in this using this login method, and we are redirecting them to the home page. Before we actually get to using this successful login values, we need to do a little more of our session setup. So after this step, now that our user has registered, we've inserted their information to the database, all of that has taken place successfully. We need to get to the user verification part. What we're trying to achieve is that, currently, if you redirect the user to the home page, they are taken to, inside our pins route, we have this. Our home page over here, the default route is going to render index.ejs and display all of our existing pins, which is great. However, inside our navigation, what we are trying to achieve is currently, if you go back inside this, you can see that anyone, regardless of if they're registered or not, is able to create a new pin. We want to make sure that only if the user is registered, they are logged in, and they are actually part of our database, only then can they see this new option. Else, eventually, we want to have an if-else condition that allows them to log in and register. If they are logged in and registered, only then should they be able to see this functionality to create a new pin.